It looks like we're making progress, guys. Both Cardano and crypto as a whole just keep marching forward no matter what gets thrown at us. While this was always a foregone conclusion for those of us who understood the benefits of true decentralization, I think the mainstream is just starting to wake up to what this all really means. Ready? Let's go. I know some of you are probably grumbling to yourselves right now. Sam Bankman-Fried, why am I looking at him? We'll get to that. We're going to talk about the House Financial Services Committee hearing today, P2P going live on the Testnet, and the recent fireside chat with Frederick Regard of the Cardano Foundation. We had a big crypto hearing at the House Financial Services Committee today. If you're not aware, that's a different entity than the Senate committee with the dragon that we've covered before. This is in the House of Representatives. That was in the Senate. Along with Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX, the committee also had the heads of Circle, Bitfury, Paxos, and Coinbase as witnesses. Sam Bankman-Fried seems to be getting a lot of publicity lately as sort of like a young crypto billionaire who lives in Hong Kong. In fact, at one point he was asked about whether or not he still lived in Hong Kong. Apparently that's no longer the case, but he's been getting a lot of publicity lately. And of course, he showed up before this committee. So this committee hearing went a little bit differently than what we'd expect, given what we've seen in the past. I think a lot of people, myself included, sort of expect a lot of misplaced focus in these types of hearings. They like to focus a lot on easy stuff that's not really crypto stuff, like terrorist financing. And a little bit of that popped up in this hearing. Somebody asked about terrorist financing, and they were even throwing around the name of a famous terrorist organization. And one of the witnesses handled this really well. He said, actually, Bitcoin is great for this kind of stuff because of the transparency of blockchains, Bitcoin, and by extension, all of crypto. He said, in fact, in the Colonial Pipeline hack, the only reason you were able to pinpoint the culprits was because of the transparency of the Bitcoin blockchain. And he specifically said, hey, if they had asked for cash or diamonds or anything like that, you never would have caught them. You caught them solely because they asked for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is actually great for this. And that was a little bit of a showstopper. It sort of put an end to, I'm not going to say that was the last mention of terrorist financing in the hearing, but it kind of put a stop to that line of questioning at that point, at least. The other big ace in the pocket Congress people seem to always think they're holding is the environmental thing. Ever since the energy consumption of Bitcoin was widely publicized, it's like the other ace in their pocket. The first one is like anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, narco financing. The other one is the environment. How dare you? How dare you, crypto people, try to destroy the planet? This was great because the representative, I believe, from Stellar was exactly the wrong person for them to throw this at. So the congressperson put this to the Stellar representative, and she was like, hey, on a lot of blockchains, that's not the case at all. In fact, some blockchains have very, very low energy consumption. I thought that was a great thing to highlight, and it was sort of accepted by the congressperson who asked the question. Other Congress people had sort of moved beyond that like knee-jerk reaction of hearing crypto and immediately going to terrorist financing, narco trafficker financing, environmental destruction. And some of the Congress people seem to be much more focused on the same thing that I think a lot of us in crypto are focused on when we think about sort of regulation and crypto in general. And that's the offshoring of innovation. One congressperson in particular said, hey, during the internet boom, the build out of the first generation of the internet, a huge amount of that innovation took place in Silicon Valley. And there wasn't this offshoring of innovation that seems to be going on right now in crypto. And that was when he actually asked Sam Bankman-Fried if he lived in Hong Kong. I think Sam Bankman-Fried didn't understand the intent of the question. He was like, no, I no longer live in Hong Kong. But what the congressperson was trying to point out was that it doesn't make any sense that Sam Bankman-Fried would be living in Hong Kong if the regulations were currently as friendly to crypto as regulation had been to the internet in the early days. And I know we could all cite examples of crazy regulations that hampered the internet in the early days, but there's so much uncertainty right now in regulation, which was another theme that I think the witnesses, sort of played well upon, pointing out the uncertainty in the regulations. And there was a little bit of vilification of Gensler's SEC too. As a crypto person, it's hard to not applaud that because there isn't regulatory certainty, especially with the SEC and Chairman Gensler's comments. And when he's asked about that, he claims there is a lot of certainty. So I'm hoping this committee hearing will sort of push everybody in the direction of understanding that we actually don't have good regulatory certainty as to the securities regulations, no matter what Gensler says. Another theme that the witnesses seemed to riff well on was the need for a single regulatory body for crypto instead of the fragmented regulation that is typical in Washington and atypical in other jurisdictions. And sort of throughout the hearing, at different points in the hearing, you could hear various people saying, hey, this type of financial institution in the US might be regulated by 5 different agencies, whereas in a lot of other jurisdictions, you just have sort of one big financial regulator. And they also be stressing the need to have one new crypto entity instead of having the SEC carve out its piece of crypto regulation, the CFTC carve out its piece, the FDIC carve out its piece, FinCEN carve out its piece. I think this is wise. I don't know if it's something that can actually be pulled off. I don't know if it's possible to actually get one crypto regulatory entity, no matter how much better that would be for everybody involved. I wonder if this fragmented regulation is just too entrenched in Washington, but I love that all the witnesses were sort of on the same page on that. Another large area of focus for the Congress people on the committee was stablecoins. And I know this is due in part to the president's working group focusing so much on stablecoins. Stablecoins seems to be one of the things they're very afraid of. Gensler has various types of DeFi that he seems to be terrified of. For the president's working group, which is sort of a cross-agency body made up of a bunch of different regulators, they seem to be very terrified of stablecoins. And, there are reasons for that. But I think the representative from Circle did a great job here distinguishing assets like USDC, which I believe he said is backed wholly by USD and treasury assets, from other types of stablecoins that might not be backed on a one-to-one basis by any real asset, might be backed by other things. Obviously, the name that jumps to mind when you think about those things is Tether. But I thought the witnesses as a whole did a great job, and it wasn't as bad as I imagined. A lot of the Congress people seem to be much more well informed about crypto. There's still people who are clueless. One guy seemed to be a perfectly smart guy, and he admitted he was sort of clueless. One congressperson was kind of clueless about crypto, but he said, hey, I'm on a fact-finding mission, truly, and I would just like to, ask a few questions, which I thought was great. It seems that the Congress people, to the extent that they represent the mainstream, it seems like the mainstream is actually waking up and understanding that crypto is not just a tool of the dark web for terrorist financing and, not just something that's going to result in something frivolous that'll result in environmental destruction. I think people, the mainstream, is actually beginning to wake up a little bit and understand that crypto is the next. It's already the big area of innovation, and we don't want to strangle it or smother it. We want to let it flourish in the same way that the internet was allowed to flourish in the United States in its early days. We also saw the introduction of P2P on the Testnet today. This is a peer-to-peer network that streamlines communication between nodes and allows for direct interaction, automated peer selection, and greater decentralization. This is one of those kind of behind-the-scenes developments. I think a lot of stake pool operators, anybody running a node, probably has always wished they had ever since the ITN days. It's kind of always been in the makings, but here we go. It's finally on testnet. The Cardano Foundation also dropped a new fireside chat with Cardano Foundation CEO Frederick Gregard. So they started out with an interesting discussion about the history of the Cardano Foundation and its original domicile on the Isle of Man, and why Switzerland is the best current jurisdiction for the Cardano Foundation. Apparently, in the Isle of Man. They couldn't quite the regulations and practices didn't allow for the banks to provide the right kinds of interaction with the Cardano Foundation. And there was quite a discussion about various jurisdictions and why Switzerland is currently the best. They then moved on to the 24-month roadmap. So they're going to form a regulated financial institutions and exchanges department to support those kinds of entities. I think everybody knows Frederick Regard kind of comes from the financial world. So it makes sense that with him at the helm, the Cardano Foundation would focus on something like that. They'll also form a new technical team to create a new version of DB Sync and a new blockchain explorer. I was a little bit surprised. I think we also saw a release of a latest version of DB Sync out of IOHK this week, but apparently in their discussions with various types of financial institutions, they see a need for another version of DB Sync. I and I think anybody who uses Cardano can certainly see the need for blockchain explorers. But it'll be interesting to see those products come out. He said they will also have product owners for various verticals like digital identity and metadata. He also got a question about how Cardano intends to attract developers over from other blockchains. I think this is always an interesting question because it sort of presumes that the path to success is attracting developers from other blockchains. I always wonder about the extent to which that's actually true, since we seem to have so much luck sort of building our own homegrown developers and then letting them develop on the Cardano network. So Frederick talked a little bit in answering that question. He talked a little bit about the Cardano Foundation's developer portal, and he also mentioned something interesting that I didn't know, and that's that Emergo is planning on getting another 3,000 Plutus developers through training in the next 6 months. I knew that Emergo had its Emergo Academy, and I've even met someone who was taking those Emergo Plutus developer classes. But I didn't realize that Emergo had such ambitious plans to put 3,000 Plutus developers through training in the next 6 months. I believe I heard that correctly from Frederick here. Another interesting question revolved around whether or not the CF had any plans to work with any ministries of education or environment of any nation states. This seemed like a very specific question to me, and maybe it was cued by some of the things he had said in answering previous questions, but he responded that he does have information on that, but it would be shared on a case-by-case basis, and he mentioned that those matters are often being covered by NDAs. So it sounds like there's something there. It sounds like he is working, the CF does have plans to work with some ministry of education or environment or some other ministry maybe, but he can't talk about it right now. He also echoed what we've often heard from Charles, that these things usually take 4 to 5 years. He did say there are several countries that are very interested in this kind of thing. Going back to the financial theme, he got another question about bank adoption of Cardano. I thought his response was interesting. He immediately started talking about inflation and the disinflationary nature of a cryptocurrency with a hard cap like Cardano. He also mentioned that banks have lost the public's trust and blockchain transparency could help with this. These are the kinds of things I hope this is exactly what banks are talking to him about. It would be amazing if banks were recognizing that there wasn't much trust in the traditional financial institutions, and that blockchain technology was a way for them to give the public transparency into what they're doing. I think the second everybody in the mainstream realized what fractional reserve banking was, I think the second that curtain was pulled back, people started looking at banks differently. And I think Frederick is indicating here that banks, what I hope he's indicating is that banks are already realizing that blockchains might be a route for them to win back some of that trust. So I hope those are the actual conversations he's having with some of these banks. In terms of major objectives for the next year, Frederick listed sort of these big sort of ideals instead of concrete objectives. The interviewer asked for 3 objectives, just a bullet list of 3 objectives. And he sort of listed these big ideals: accountability, progress, and the establishment of infrastructure products that will allow for scaling and reliable large scale adoption. I like that last one. The first 2, accountability and progress, Yes, definitely. But the last one, establishing infrastructure projects that will allow for scaling and large scale adoption. I think I kind of like this division of labor between IOHK. Obviously, IOHK is in the Cardano infrastructure business, but I like that the Cardano Foundation is thinking a lot about scaling and reliable large scale adoption. Whether or not that should be a product pursuit of theirs or just something they support with sort of human services and interaction with, you know, exchanges and developers and projects being built on Cardano. I don't know, but I like that they're thinking about those kind of things. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.